Hello everybody, this is Alex, also known as Solanus Dracone. A long while back in fact, I posted a message on the Reddit board for the Dragon Riders of Pern stating that I intended to begin a book synopsis/review series on that very series. Well, now is the time I'm beginning to do that, and this will kind of mark the beginning of a trend on this channel. Games just don't seem to be bringing in the draw of viewers that I'd like, so I'm going to take a different approach and start working on literature, because I like to read. At least, this is going to go on for a little while. I'll probably play a couple other games, but only stuff that really catches my eye and feels fun to play. Anyways, on with what I'm on about. The Dragon Riders of Pern is a book series originally done by Anne McCaffrey, and later on involving her son Todd more and more, until the unfortunate passing of Anne in late 2011, where Todd took over completely. I do not exaggerate when I say that this book series has been monumentally formative for me. It is the first big fantasy book series which I applied myself to, and I have been reading these books since roughly 1994, when I was just starting high school. My imagination, when it was at its most malleable, was shaped and transformed forever by this book series, and I want to share my love of these fantastic books with you, my audience. So, over the course of the next couple weeks, I'm going to be describing in detail the setup of the world of Pern. I will discuss its history, its politics, its social structures, and any other random fascinating things which come to mind. This episode will focus mainly on the author and the history of the book series itself. I will be going over the range of years that the books were released, and a little bit of its evolution, as well as the changes which came about as a result of the shift from Anne to Todd. I'm going to call this my primer series, and after I've completed that, then I'll move on to actual book synopsis. So, let's begin. Anne McCaffrey was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1926. She graduated cum laude in 1947 from Radcliffe College, with a degree in Slavonic languages and literature. In 1950, she married Horace Wright Johnson, and together they had 3 kids, Alex, Todd, and Georgianne. She served a term as a secretary-treasurer of the Science Fiction Writers of America from 1968 to 1970, and even handcrafted the Nebula Award trophies. In 1970, Anne moved with her 2 youngest kids to Ireland after filing for divorce, and by way of the writing circuits in that general region, she met up with Jack Cohen, who would be a consultant on the science of Pern. Because if you need to know one thing about the nature of the Pern novels, it's that they are science fantasy as much as science fiction. A real effort is made to include the best scientific accuracy possible given the subject matter at hand, and for that reason I found this book series an excellent diversion from the usual medieval fantasy stuff, which has always been the most prevalent. There's no magic here, folks, just science. Or for those of a more pessimistic or realistic viewpoint, if you're that way inclined, pseudoscience at least. Technically, the first Pern books were 2 separate novellas, Weir Search and Dragon Rider. They covered to a large extent the events of the first official book of the series, Dragonflight, and for her work she was the first woman to win a Hugo Award for fiction, and the first woman to win a Nebula Award, full stop. I get the chronology a little mixed up here, so I'll state up front, her first full-on actual novel-length book for the series was Dragonflight, which was released in 1968, 2 years before the move to Ireland. Dragon Quest, her second book, was in production and mostly done before the move, and released afterward in 1970. At this point, Anne diverged from what is considered the original trilogy to release what is called the Harper Hall trilogy, with Dragon Song in 1976, Dragon Singer in 1977, and while The White Dragon was released in 1978 and was the 3rd book of the original trilogy, Dragon Drums was released in 1979. Anne herself, and I, both insist it is better to read the entire Harper Hall trilogy before moving on to The White Dragon to finish out the original trilogy, as new characters seem to pop out of nowhere in The White Dragon, who are all introduced in the Harper Hall trilogy properly. By the way, I never met or even corresponded or spoke or in any way interacted with Anne McCaffrey. I want to make absolutely clear right up front before anyone starts raising eyebrows, I was never more than just another fan. The main story of the Pern books takes place in a time period known as the Ninth Pass. Most of the books are focused either just leading up to or during that particular time period. Anne took a bit of a diversion from 1983 to 1988 to write some books from previous time periods in the series, which is another thing I love about the books. This world spans thousands of years. We're introduced to characters from the very dawn of the founding of Pern, and loads of them throughout most of history leading up to the current events, with direct connections through lineage and general influence of the first people to set foot on the world. It is a wonderfully deep, long, and complex story that is told from multiple viewpoints over multiple thousands of years. Truly epic. In 1983, Anne released Morita, Dragon Lady of Pern, which is one of those books from Pern's past, followed in 1986 by Nerilka's story, a telling of the events of Morita, but from the perspective of another character, Nerilka, who had a massively different history to Morita, but their stories still intertwined. In 1988, Dragon's Dawn came out, which detailed the original landing upon Pern by the colonists, and how they came to discover the series' main threat, and how they dealt with it. It is the definite prequel to all of the books. She got back to the Ninth Pass in 1989 with the release of Renegades of Pern, which takes place partly through the events prior to the original trilogy, and then later on moves to present day. This was followed in 1991 by All the Weirs of Pern, which is a direct sequel to Renegades. She took another trip back to the past in 1993 with a book called The Chronicles of Pern, which included 5 expository stories, mostly from after the events of Dragon's Dawn, but with one that delves 200 years even before the events of Dragon's Dawn. Dolphins of Pern came out in 1994, and provided another point of view story for the events of All the Weirs, and even had a little bit after that. 1996 saw the release of Red Star Rising, which was renamed Dragon's Eye for the US release, and takes place just prior to and up to the beginning of the Second Pass, so comes chronologically after the Chronicles of Pern. In 1998, Master Harper of Pern came out, which was a prequel to Dragonflight, and covers the life and upbringing of arguably the most popular character in the series, Master Harper Robinton, and ends with another point of view of the events at the beginning of Dragonflight. In 2001, Skies of Pern came out, and takes place after the events of the Dolphins of Pern. In 2002, A Gift of Dragons was released, and was another collective of 4 short stories, mostly occurring just prior to the main series, with one occurring in an indeterminate time period. At this point, Anne and Todd began working together in earnest, with Todd receiving top billing on a new series, whose novels take place before and during the Third Pass. Dragon's Kin came out in 2003, followed by Dragon's Blood in 2005, then Dragon's Fire in 2006, Dragon Harper in 2007, Dragon Heart in 2008, Dragon Girl in 2010, Dragon's Time in 2011, and Sky Dragons in 2012. As of the recording of this video, we are all currently awaiting the release of After the Fall is Over, which is supposed to take us to the time after the Ninth Pass, and would be the first book where Todd is pretty much going to be on his own. Other forms of media exist for this series: a graphic novel of Dragonflight, a couple video games which released on Atari and Sega Saturn, and a beautiful illustrated encyclopedia of sorts called The Dragon Lover's Guide to Pern, released in 1989, and sort of explains a lot of the mundane questions people might have had about the minutiae of Pern, as well as many other little goodies such as a soundtrack and art books. So that covers the first episode. I just wanted to discuss the history of the authors and the history of the book releases to give an idea of how long this series has been running. 49 years as of this recording. How many other fantasy series can you name which have run that long? Starting next week, I will begin to talk about the actual world itself. But for now, I want to thank you all for watching. Once again, I am Alex, also known as Solinus Dracone, and this has been my Pern Primer Part 1. Goodbye.